You often have very graphic, gory descriptions, and you will have seen with the painting, the descriptions of the painting and the descriptions of Dorian Gray and his debauchery become increasingly graphic. Interestingly enough, Oscar Wilde actually had more chapters in this novel, but they were so graphic that the publisher said that they would not publish the novel with those chapters in them. So he had to tidy it up a little bit and cut it quite significantly. There's always in Gothic literature an element of horror. And you see that again with Dorian Gray himself as he becomes more and more depraved towards the end of the novel. And very often in Gothic literature there's some sort of a romantic element, and we see something of that romance with Dorian Gray and Sybil Vane. Then if we move on to some definitions, you will have seen, for example, in the preface that we'll look very briefly at, you've got all these little sayings, just a whole couple of pages of sayings in the preface, and those are known as aphorisms, and you can have a look at the definition in your notes. And more important is the definition of epigram. So an epigram is a brief, interesting, and very often satirical statement, and Henry is full of them. You see him use them in almost every conversation that we have with Henry. We see him using those aphorisms. And then the last definition that I want to have a look at is one really just to make the novel a little bit more interesting. And that's the definition of an antisocial personality disorder, better known as psychopath or sociopath. And I've given you a list of the character traits of those characters. Both Henry and Dorian Gray show elements of being sociopaths. And it's a fascinating study. If we had to ask a psychologist, for example, to do a study of the two of them, it would be interesting to see what they came up with. But they definitely both have elements of the sociopath within them. And so it's quite a fun exercise, actually, to look at them from that perspective. And at the end of the novel, when we hopefully are back in the classroom together, we can actually debate to what extent either of them fulfills the character traits of a sociopath. All right, so let's have a look at the preface very briefly. So preface, if you had to pronounce it differently, preface, is usually at the beginning of a novel, and it usually gives you some kind of introduction to the way that the author views his subject matter. So very often, for example, if you had to read an autobiography, it would have a preface that would have been written by a close associate of the author who would make his own comments on this particular person and why this particular piece of work is significant. And so the preface in this novel is quite interesting because it gives us a whole lot of aphorisms to do with the perception of art. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of them for you, and then you can have a look at how they relate to the novel, and particularly in the opening chapter as Basil and Henry have their conversation about art. So if you turn now in your text itself to the preface, that's on page 3. I'm going to just highlight a couple that we might explore at a later stage. So the first two are important, where it says the artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. Now that particular one, of course, is important in the way that Basil views his painting of Dorian Gray. And then if you look over the page onto page 4, and you have 4 lines together there, it's about a third of the way down the page there. It says, all art is at once surface and symbol. Now, of course, the painting itself is very symbolic, and we will explore this idea of surface and symbol as the novel focuses more and more around the painting. It carries on. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. For those of you who have read the novel, you might make an association with what happens to Basil. We continue. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. All right, so that's the preface of the novel. It doesn't really pertain to anything more than the idea that art is for art's sake, and we'll have a look at that in some more detail. Now, you will have seen at the end of the document where I gave you the things to do beforehand, that you need to have created a character page or a character table, if you like, a mind map, whatever works for you. Remember, you've got to study from these notes, so do what works for you. For each of your main characters, so that's Basil Hallward, Sir Henry Wotton, and Dorian Gray himself. And if you haven't done that, you need to pause this voice note so that you can get on and do that, because now every time I refer you to a part of the chapter, you're going to need to be making notes on some of your characters. And then I also asked you to create some theme pages, so you can do that. Those I will simply refer you to as we continue, and you need to just explore where they fit in, put a page reference for yourselves, and highlight what you need. Remember that if you're using a text that's been issued to you by Northcliffe, you may not write in that text, so please make sure that you use sticky notes where you want to make notes on the text. Those of you who are using your own novels, your own text, you might want to highlight or color code your characters. I prefer to color code mine because it just makes it easier for me to refer back to when I'm looking at the text again. So I will simply just say to you, use your color for whoever, and then I will give you the important quotes that you need to look at.